Welcome to Somali Nexus, the channel where Somali history, identity, and culture come alive through powerful storytelling and untold truths. Today, we dive deep into one of the most extraordinary resistance movements Africa has ever witnessed, the Somali Darwish Movement. More than a rebellion, it was a revolution of soul, spirit, and sovereignty. Led by the indomitable Sayid Mohamed Abdullah Hassan, this movement wasn't just a war against British, Italian, and Ethiopian colonizers. It was a spiritual and nationalist awakening that burned fiercely for over 2 decades. At the heart of the Darwish was Taleh, a city carved in the deserts of Nugal Valley, a symbol of Somali autonomy. Within its walls were mosques, schools, and strategy rooms where warriors were trained not just to fight, but to believe. Poetry became their weapon, faith, their armor. The Sayid wasn't only a commander, he was a visionary poet. His verses, echoing across the plains, stirred resistance and carved unity from tribal division. In a land where oral tradition was sacred, his words were law. His movement, a blend of Islamic reform and Somali nationalism, was decades ahead of its time. But with strength came sacrifice. The Darwishes faced relentless colonial campaigns, famine, betrayal, and one of Africa's first aerial bombings. Yet they stood firm. Even when Taleh fell in 1920 and the Sayid passed the following year, the flame of their struggle never died. Today, the story of the Darwishes still whispers through Somali songs, poetry, and memory. It challenges us to remember not just how they fought, but why. Join us on Somali Nexus as we relive this saga of resistance, reclaim the legacy of the Sayid, and uncover the forgotten truths of a people who dared to dream of freedom long before independence was even imagined. Stay tuned. History is calling.
Okay, so let's dive in. Try and picture this. You're looking at the Horn of Africa, late 1800s. Think arid landscapes, rolling plains, these really rugged mountains. Mm-hmm. And right there, something pretty extraordinary starts happening. It's more than just fighting.
Right.
For over 20 years, this movement grows the Darwish Movement, led by, this really compelling figure, Sayid Mohamed Abdullah Hassan.
A name that carries a lot of weight.
Exactly. And it's just this powerful early example of African resistance against imperialism. That's what we're really getting into today.
Yeah, and it's so important to see it that way. I mean, colonial period, it wasn't just Europeans walking in. Movements like the Darwish, they push back hard on that idea.
They really do.
They show this fierce determination, people wanting to protect their sovereignty, their identity, and the sources we have really lay out all the different layers of this resistance.
Absolutely. The material we're looking at, it covers everything from the first sparks, the cultural side, the spiritual side, how it eventually declined, and, the impact it still has. Mm-hmm. So our mission, basically, is to unpack all that, to really get what drove this movement and why we're still talking about it.
Okay, so where do we start? To really understand it, we need to set the scene. What were things like in the Somali territories back then? What was the backdrop?
Good question. Okay, late 19th century Somalia. It's fascinating. You've got this decentralized system, lots of different clans.
Right, no single central government in the European sense.
Exactly. Society is deeply tied to pastoral life, moving with herds. And they have these incredibly strong oral traditions. Poetry, storytelling, super important.
And religion.
Islam is absolutely woven into everything. And they have their own customary law called hair. It governed a lot of daily life, really respected.
So a complex society with its own structures.
Definitely. And what really stands out is this fierce spirit of independence.
Yeah.
Even without that central government, they were, very much their own people.
That's key. It wasn't just empty land waiting to be claimed. There were systems, traditions, a strong sense of self, even if it looked different to Europeans. And Islam, as you said, a powerful unifier.
Right. But then the scramble for Africa happens. After the Berlin Conference, 1884, 85, Britain, Italy, France, They start carving up the map.
Drawing lines.
Drawing lines. Suddenly, these Somali communities are split up, their autonomy is undermined, trade routes disrupted, and nobody asked them.
No consultation whatsoever.
Zero. So you can just imagine the resentment. It must have been huge.
It's a classic colonial playbook, isn't it? Borders decided thousands of miles away, ignoring the reality on the ground. That division is crucial context for understanding why the Darwish movement emerges.
Definitely. And right into this environment steps Sayid Mohamed Abdullah Hassan.
The central figure.
Yeah. Born 1856. And he's not just a fighter. He's a poet, a warrior, and a religious scholar from the Ogaden region.
Quite a combination.
He'd studied Islam in Mecca, in Sudan. He was really influenced by the Aliyah Sufi order. They emphasized piety, social reform, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And he becomes totally disillusioned with Somali leaders who start working with the colonials. He saw it as like a spiritual betrayal and a huge political mistake.
So he's bringing together his religious learning, his Somali identity, and maybe ideas about reform he saw abroad, applying it all to this specific crisis.
Exactly. And he shows up just as the traditional leadership is kind of fractured. Some are trying to cooperate, some are resisting weakly, some are just lost.
So a power vacuum.
Pretty much. And he fills it with this radical vision. Islamic revival and national resistance. Get rid of the foreigners. And this message really hits home, especially with younger people and clans who felt left out.
Okay, so he has this powerful message. How does that spark turn into a full-blown movement? What made his call so resonant?
Well, his rhetoric was just incredibly potent. It blended deep Islamic belief with this fierce Somali pride. He's basically saying colonialism is an attack on your faith and your dignity.
A powerful combination.
And it worked. He starts gathering followers, the Darwishes, devout Muslims, people from clans feeling pushed aside, all looking for protection, for purpose.
And the name itself, Darwish, it has those religious, almost ascetic connotations, right? Which probably added to the legitimacy.
Absolutely. It framed it as more than just politics. It was a righteous struggle, a jihad, in his terms.
Okay, so it's gaining followers, but it wasn't just a random uprising.
No, not at all. It was organized.
Yeah.
The Sayid set up a headquarters at Taleh in the Nugal Valley. This place becomes the absolute heart of the movement.
Taleh.
A symbol of Somali autonomy, a center for religious revival. The sources describe it as this impressive fortress, city, mosques, schools, administration buildings.
Wow. So more than just a military base, it's like a statement, a functioning capital almost.
Exactly. Building that under constant threat. It just shows their commitment. It was a massive job. Think thick defensive walls, underground rooms, watchtowers.
Incredible engineering. A mix of styles.
Yeah, Islamic, Somali, military, all blended together. It was meant to last. And from Taleh, starting around 1899, they launched these fierce campaigns against the British, Italians, Ethiopians too.
And they were effective.
Very. Masters of guerrilla warfare. They knew the land, used camel cavalry incredibly well, swift raids, hit hard, then melt away.
That must have driven the colonial powers crazy.
Completely. They couldn't pin them down easily. And this success built their reputation, drew more people in.
Fearless and disciplined, the sources say.
Absolutely. Their attacks on garrisons, supply lines, collaborators, they were calculated and often devastating. They even had an intelligence network. This was a sophisticated resistance.
Okay, so they had some real successes early on. That must have boosted morale hugely and really worried the colonial powers. Any specific battles that stand out?
Definitely. The Battle of Gumburu in 1903, that was a big one. The Darwishes basically wiped out a British detachment.
Wow.
Sent shockwaves. And it encouraged more Somalis to join up. Then there's Gulmadoba, 1913. Even more significant, maybe.
What happened there?
They killed Colonel Richard Corfield. He was a key British figure trying to crush the movement. Killing him and many of his troops became this huge symbol of Somali resilience.
A major propaganda victory, even if it brought retaliation.
Oh, it did. Big time. The British hit back hard after that. But yeah, these wins show they could inflict real damage.
But it wasn't easy. They were up against major powers. What were the big challenges they faced constantly?
Oh, huge challenges. Logistics were a nightmare. Getting weapons, ammo, even food and water in that landscape. Constant struggle. Then you always had internal clan rivalries bubbling up. The colonials were experts at exploiting those divisions.
Divide and rule.
Exactly. And the environment itself, brutal heat, scarce water, disease. It was tough. What's amazing is how the Sayid held it together.
How?
His charisma, mostly. His poetry, his sermons. They were incredibly powerful tools for unity, keeping spirits up despite everything.
So his leadership was absolutely critical. But the British didn't just sit back. They adapted their strategy.
They did, and it got much uglier. They started using scorched earth tactics,
Meaning?
burning villages, destroying crops, killing livestock, anything to deny the Darwishes resources and support from the population.
Devastating for civilians.
Absolutely devastating. Forced displacement, mass slaughter of animals which were people's livelihoods. The psychological toll must have been immense.
Grim picture of colonial warfare. And
Yeah.
it wasn't just the British they were fighting.
No, the Italians got more involved, worried about their own colony further south.
Right.
They helped the British, worked with rival clans,
Okay.
and the Ethiopians too. They were worried about the Sayid's influence spreading among Somalis in the Ogaden, so they launched operations against him as well. It became a multi-front war.
So facing all that, multiple enemies, logistics, scorched earth, yet they kept going for over 20 years. It sounds like the movement itself kind of evolved.
It really did. I mean, sure, there was dissent sometimes, people deserted, but overall, it became more than just fighting. It solidified as this potent symbol.
A symbol of what?
Anti-colonial defiance, the desires for Somali unity. It was about preserving their culture, their way of life,
Yeah.
against these massive external forces.
And a huge part of that cultural preservation and the resistance itself was the Sayid's poetry, right? That seems really unique.
It absolutely is. He wasn't just giving orders, he was composing constantly, hundreds of poems in Somali.
And using them strategically.
Totally. To rally support, to absolutely shred the colonials and collaborators in verse, and to paint this vivid picture of a free Somalia. His poems were packed with metaphors, moral authority.
And in an oral culture.
They spread like wildfire. People memorized them, recited them. It helped knit together different clans who might otherwise be rivals. It created a shared cause, a shared identity through culture.
So poetry wasn't just art, it was communication, propaganda, education, all rolled into one.
Exactly. Oral poetry was the central pillar of Somali culture. The Saidi was a master. He used it to teach religion, explain politics, mobilize people spiritually. He'd criticize collaborators mercilessly, praise his warriors, lament the suffering. He took traditional forms, but packed them with new theological and political meaning,
Right.
made them immediate, relevant.
Are there specific poems that are famous examples of this?
Yeah, a couple are mentioned often as Taleh, kind of the movement's manifesto, staking their claim, and Dardaran, which means advice, like a guide for his followers on morality, strategy.
So these weren't just songs, they were powerful statements.
Absolutely. In a society where most people couldn't read, these poems were their manifestos, their news, their inspiration.
And his style, what made it distinctive?
It was this really interesting mix. You can hear the classical Arabic influences from his religious studies, but fused with Somali poetic traditions. Very eloquent.
Clever, too.
Yeah, he
Okay.
used a lot of allegory personification. So he could criticize enemies without always naming them directly, building this shared sense of who the good guys and bad guys were.
Creating a moral universe for his followers.
Exactly.
And besides poetry, were there other cultural things holding them together?
Oh, yeah. Songs were important for morale, remembering battles, storytelling, obviously, passing down history and values. Reciting the Quran constantly reinforced their shared faith. Sermons. Ritual, powerful public sermons, absolutely. And symbolic rituals, too. Things designed specifically to bring different clans together under that banner of faith and resistance. It was a total cultural mobilization.
It's an incredible picture of resilience, but ultimately, the movement did decline. What changed the balance of power?
Well, into the 1910s, and especially around 1920, the British really stepped up their game. They learned from mistakes.
How so?
Better equipped troops, better training. They solidified alliances with rival Somali clans, which was crucial. And they built infrastructure, roads, communication lines.
Allowing them to move faster, coordinate better.
Exactly. It became less about chasing shadows and more about a long-term strategy of containment and strangulation.
And the Sayid himself, was his leadership changing?
Sources suggest his health was failing in the later years. He couldn't lead campaigns personally like he used to.
Meaning he had to delegate more.
Yeah, relying more on his lieutenants. And while some were capable, maybe they didn't have that same unifying charisma, that same strategic spark he did. It possibly created some weaknesses.
And all this leads up to the final attack on Taleh in 1920. That sounds decisive.
It was the killer blow, a massive, coordinated British assault. And the big difference, they used airplanes.
Air power. Back then.
One of the very first times it was used in colonial warfare in Africa, bombing Taleh from the air. It was devastating militarily, but the psychological impact was huge too.
Shattering that idea of Taleh as invincible.
Completely. It demoralized the fighters badly. The fortress they'd built, the heart of their movement, was being destroyed from the sky.
So the destruction of Taleh wasn't just strategic, it was deeply symbolic.
Totally. It had been their anchor for so long. After it fell, the remaining leaders had to retreat, scatter into the hinterlands.
And the Sayid?
He died of illness the next year, 1921, in the Ogaden. And his death really marked the end of the organized Darwish resistance.
So the fighting stopped. What happened right after? Did the movement just disappear?
Well, the active resistance ended. Many followers surrendered. Others just melted back into nomadic life. The dream of that independent Islamic Somali state, it was put on hold.
But the memory didn't die.
Not at all. The memory of the Darwishes, their struggle, the Sayid, it lived on in songs and stories passed down through families. It became part of the Somali identity.
And how is the Sayid himself remembered now in Somalia?
He's become a major national hero, almost legendary. Symbol of resistance, resilience, faith. You see his name everywhere, schools, streets. His story is told and retold. He's an icon.
Though, like many historical figures, there are debates, right? The sources mention historians looking critically at some aspects.
That's true. There's discussion about, how authoritarian his rule might have been sometimes, the human cost of decades of war, the complex clan politics involved.
Nuance is important.
Absolutely. But even with those debates, his massive impact on shaping Somali nationalism, that sense of a shared identity against outsiders, is undeniable. The Darwish movement really planted those seeds for later independence struggles.
And did his influence reach beyond Somalia?
It did. That blend of Islam and anti-colonialism was inspirational for other African movements later on. They saw a reflection of their own struggles in his.
Right.
And Taleh itself, the ruins, they're still there. A powerful historical site. People visit, historians, descendants, their efforts now to preserve it, restore parts of it, reclaiming that heritage.
So fast forward to today, what's the relevance of this story now for Somalia, maybe even more broadly?
Well, for Somalia, still dealing with conflict, intervention, the Darwish story resonates. It's a source of pride, a reminder of past resistance and unity, but maybe also a cautionary tale about the costs of conflict.
Yeah, it's complex, and the sources warn against sort of misusing the legacy, right? Just grabbing the symbols without the substance.
Exactly. It's important to look deeper than just the battles. Understand the spiritual side, the cultural depths. Honoring the legacy means engaging with those ideals, justice, self-determination, integrity.
And the Sayid's emphasis on principles, education, faith, discipline, those seem pretty timeless.
They really do. His critiques of things like materialism, corruption, complacency, they still hit home. And his sheer commitment to his beliefs, despite everything, that's a powerful example of conviction.
And it's good to hear their efforts to keep this history alive.
Yeah, preserving the poetry, archiving it digitally so it's accessible, trying to reconstruct parts of Taleh, and making sure new generations learn about it through education, through art, keeping the story relevant.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main things to take away from the Darwish movement?
I think the biggest thing is realizing it was so much more than just military resistance. It was this incredibly complex movement fueled by deep faith, strong nationalism, and this vibrant cultural expression, especially through the Sayid's poetry. A potent mix against colonialism.
Definitely multifaceted. And maybe a final thought to leave people with. In our world today, globalized, interconnected, how can stories like the Darwish movement, this blend of faith, culture, fighting for self-determination, how can they help us think about struggles for identity and autonomy happening right now all over the globe?
That's a great question. Something to really mull over.